You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Happy Monday evening, folks. Hope you had a great weekend. I did. And it's now Monday. I hope you had a great day today, being the first day of the week. How many of you are back to work? Are your states open? Are you still in stay-at-home orders, sequestration? I hope things are starting to get back to a bit of normal for you. Yeah, the virus, they say, is still out there. But I also think we've had events prove that the stay-at-home orders don't make much sense. We'll talk about that in a minute. Before I do, I want to welcome you to the show. You're listening over on the Odyssey Radio Network, and that's ODYSY1.com, where you can hear this show, the Intrepid radio program, and a whole entire lineup that'll take you 24/7 to go through. And so there's lots of listening fun over there. Go over and check out all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio. At the same time, if you're listening via audio only, you can come over to the YouTube stream and watch the simulcast in video. And the most important part, join the family of Intrepids over in the live chat room, which is going on right now. You can add your 2 cents to the show, or just get to know people over there. It's a fun place to be, and there's a lot of good people in there that I've gotten to know very well. So, thank you for being here. Thank you for taking your time to listen. I will say right now, about Friday night's show of last week, I had used a piece of a song, The Who's song, We Won't Get Fooled Again, and I played that during about a 3-minute segment of the break at the bottom of the hour. And that song got me blocked, got the entire show blocked for the day, which was apparently a part of the new YouTube rules over there. Because I've used songs before, and I just get an email saying, there's a copyright on this song, we won't pull your file. You don't have to worry about it unless you start monetizing your channel. Well, they've apparently changed that now, at least on that song. Maybe it's because that song has been overused in the last 2 weeks due to protests and things like that. And so we're sorry about that. But those of you who are here in the chat room, they did allow the chat room to roll with a black screen, but they tuned into Odyssey Radio and listened to the audio version of the show. Now you can also do the opposite. You can listen to the stream. You can come on over, join the chat room. Not because we're blocked, but whatever your preference might be. So thanks again for being here. Now, before we get rolling, I want to just do a little self-promotion. If you have not availed yourself of this, the Intrepid Radio Program hoodie, or this, the Intrepid Radio Program t-shirt, I want you to know they're available over on my Etsy page, and that's etsy.com, that's etsy.com/shop/Son of a Patriot. And Son of a Patriot, as you know, is, because I've mentioned it many times before, is my page where I put up all of our t-shirts. And starting here on Son of a Patriot, of course, right there, we've got Daughter of a Patriot shirts. We've got, and that's the one patterned after my wife Rainey, the brunette. You can also get the redhead, and you can also get the blonde. So all of those shirts are available. Rainey's UFO shirt that you see right here. And this is one that she asked me to make, and I think a few of you had these already. I know Audrey modeled her shirt for us. Audrey over in our chat room, who runs our chat room and does a lot of stuff for Rocky and I. You can also get the Intrepid mug, and you can see it here. There's the Intrepid mug. And so that's pretty much it for my self-promotion. That's the image that's wrapped around the mug right there. So if you want to get some good garments to wear, I've ordered a bunch for myself that I hadn't had, which are coming hopefully this week. And it takes a little longer for them to ship. They don't ship overnight. It goes through the manufacturer and then comes to us. I just design them and I put them up, and we hire these manufacturing companies to make them. So all of those of you who have purchased shirts, I think in the last couple 3 months we've had like about 80 sales over there of shirts, and we get a couple of bucks per shirt. So it adds to the coffers. So we appreciate it. That helps this show exist. And thank you to all of you who also donate to this show to help me research and help things keep the lights on, or at least the radio stream on. So thank you for being here. Thank you for all you do. Thank you for taking your time to be part of this. Now, we're 5 minutes and 43 seconds into this show, so let's get on with it, shall we? I talked about at the beginning the fact that there has been overuse, I think, of the song We Won't Get Fooled Again. I think that's the reason my show got blacked out. I think also on that might be the reason. The show got blacked out on Friday, and that's why they made a copyright issue out of it. I'm not going to test those waters again. I've got plenty of copyright-free music and music that I have copyright permission on, and we'll be using those in the show. And there's something about that I mentioned at the beginning of this. We're talking tonight, continuing on talking about the peace narrative and what that is. Remember, I talked last Friday, if you caught all this toward the beginning of the show, that we have narratives that we follow. And we kind of have our narrative against their narrative. Or they have their narrative against our narrative. And there's a constant war between them. We're always battling things. And I have to admit, I'm very guilty of the good fight. If somebody wants to bring something or draw me into the fight, I can throw my 2 cents worth in very easily. And I think I'm pretty fast on my feet that way in responding, because I've been looking at these things for years. These things in general, politics and things like that. And if I don't know, I'll go look things up. Have I been guilty of posting memes that were not backed by reality? Yeah, I have. Sometimes you get caught up in the argument and you want to fight your point. And it's not that I present any false information. It's that I say, yeah, well, look at what this meme says. I don't do that very often, but that happens from time to time. And so with all this battling that's going on, we are currently locked in a war narrative. Whether it be war that's represented by the military or war that's represented by differences in mindsets that are constantly fighting. And when I have said in the past, there is a narrative. You're a victim of the narrative. And the narrative, I would say, I've said it in relation to President Trump and people that have what I would call Trump derangement syndrome. Do you know that's a narrative as well? That's the narrative we use, is that people who are constantly looking to demonize every word and action and deed of the sitting president, that is a war narrative. They're fighting their point, and those who fight against that are fighting out of their war narrative. I've got to fight those who are saying these things about the president I might support. Now, I got to tell you, I don't know that I'm a big fan of Donald Trump personally. I always liked the guy before he ever got into politics. I thought, he's successful. And I found him an interesting character. Do I like his personality? Not necessarily. Do I like everything that comes out of his mouth? No, not necessarily. But I don't like everything that comes out of my relatives' mouths either. So there are people we choose to like or dislike. I had a good conversation with my own sister yesterday. She said, I have a hard time with Trump as a person. And I said, sometimes I do too. I said, but I have to look beyond that. I said, I have a hard time with Obama, who presented himself as a very classy man and presented himself very well and spoke very well. But when you looked beneath the surface, there were other issues that caused me to have problems with the man. However, I have stated this many times, and I've said it here on this show many times over the last 10 years. I have said, since Obama became president, I've said it on the radio. I said, I may not agree with his political ideologies, but I support the man as my president. Did I vote for him? No. Was he still my president? Yes, because he's the president of my country, and this is my country. Now, I may not like it. I may have spoken out against his policies. I may have spoken out against his political ideologies, but I supported the man who was in the office because this is my country. I get overtired of having heard for the last 3 years, well, he's not my president. Yeah, he is. You didn't vote for him, if that's what you mean, but he is your president. And so while some people may not like what he's accomplished, I found he's accomplished good things, so I support him. And that's where I leave that fight. But there are two narratives there. There's the narrative beneath that supports him. There's the narrative that opposes him. And those narratives are at war. And so the big question that I was presenting last Friday is, with all the things that are the narratives that we follow, how many of those narratives are the peace narrative as opposed to the war narrative? And the word narrative, just in recap, is a word that's been thrown around a lot. You see it in the news. You see it in those who oppose the mainstream media, that there is a narrative that's out there. So it's almost become cliche. But cliches are born from insight. And in this case, it's about the power of the stories that we tell about ourselves and each other and the world that coheres us in a common purpose. And a lot of things that we need to do today don't make sense if you're the only one doing them. So a story can order the world around us so that we see our choices as part of this larger happening. And granted, the larger happening unfolding on this planet now, today, currently, is bigger than any story that we could make about it. Nonetheless, for me, a story that allows me to make meaning of my life, identify my allies, and understand what my role is essential. That's our narrative. And so the understanding of the power of narrative extends to all parts of the political spectrum as well. Everyone wants to control the narrative. Have you noticed that out there? The narrative about the riots, the narrative about the protesters, the narrative about cops, the narrative about race, the narrative about the president, the narrative about people running to be president. All of these are narratives. And everyone wants to control the narrative. That's a power for either good or ill. Going back to Adolf Hitler, he understood that very well. He rode a narrative of racial superiority and national glory that legitimizes his ambitions and channeled latent cultural energies toward genocide and conquest. And today, we also have a powerful unresolved energies in society. Just like in the 1930s, discontent, desperation, hostility toward the elites. Anybody who's rich is obviously evil. That's a narrative. Anger at the way society has turned. Grief over the loss of community. How these express depends in large part on how problems and solution, cause and effect are narrated to us. And many times people don't do anything other than listen to the narrative that appeals to them. So I'm going to ask you, if you are a person who prefers peace, who prefers unity, and you want to serve peace and well-being for all people, a world of healing where society and all the beings on this planet are moving toward a greater wholeness, we'd better make sure we are telling the right story. Today, the dominant narrative, whether we recognize it or not, as I've already stated, is a war narrative. Not only on the obvious level of U.S. foreign policy and all the battling going on around the world, but identifying enemies around the world and bombing them, but also in our basic understanding of how the world works and how to solve problems. War thinking permeates the public psyche. We're always fighting. And so to build a peace narrative, we need to identify the existing foundational war narrative. And I started doing that on Friday. We talked about the myth of redemptive violence. And that's that violence that redeems us. And that's a basic tenet of the war mentality. What do you see with the riots that are going on right now? You see redemptive violence, and redemptive violence doesn't work. The war on symptom we've seen, the mentality of finding the enemy to overcome with force that extends beyond warfare. We try to weed out the symptoms, and we work to, and that's the narrative that then governs our war narrative. Root out the symptom. Find the agents of dehumanization that you see all the time in the political discourse. And that's the way we stir up war fever so that we can rise up and destroy the bad guys. And everybody on every side thinks they're the good guys. So there's always a bad guy. This has created a recipe for despair in our narratives. Our narratives have made us turn to despair, discouragement, depression. And this is what we have turned into. Power-seeking power. Right now, the narrative that is anti-Trump narrative is by the side that doesn't have the power and wants the power, so they create a narrative to demonize everything about the current sitting president. Now, flip that around. We had an anti-Obama narrative by the party that was not in power. And so this is the way we gain power in this country. Then we talked about the threat of the pacifist, the one who can, in any fight, the more and more of our political discourse has become a fight, the resolution lay in the things that are hidden by the fight, the things that both sides agree on without ever knowing it, and the question that neither side is asking. And so, fights about immigration, fights about just about everything you can think of, about health issues, about health care. So if you're a pacifist or a peacemaker, you might find that you arouse a lot of hostility from both sides of a conflict. You have that both narratives might be against you. And people who gain their identity from being on Team Good in the war against Team Evil actually need Team Evil. They need each other's side. It's like two cards leaning against each other and propping up each other. When evil's taken away, there's a crisis, a kind of political vertigo, and a desperate rush to find the new bad guy from either perspective. By the way, because remember, everybody thinks they're part of the good narrative. And so there's all these flailing attempts at the defeat of what we call axis of evil, Islamic terror, clash of civilizations. Things like pacifists are more despised than any by the enemy. So that is kind of where we left off. And we just only barely started to get into the foundations of what is a peace narrative. So now that we've recapped, and we've only got about 4 or 5 minutes left of this segment, we're going to start getting into the foundations of a peace narrative. And I'm going to ask you personally if this is something you believe you possess. As the above-mentioned examples always have demonstrated, war thinking pervades our modern civilization, from actual war to political war to ideological war. We're in a war narrative now, no matter what side you're on. It goes all the way down to cosmology, to physics, and in biology to the idea of the selfish gene, setting up a view of nature as, in the words of Rudolf Steiner, a war of each against all. All of this, I'm going to add, is obsolete science. Now we're starting to understand, with research on emergence, self-organizing systems, which are ubiquitous in nature, that the world would actually has a tendency toward order, toward beauty, as if there were an intelligence behind all things, and not toward disorder, as the second law of thermodynamics seems to imply. The selfish gene, the second law of thermodynamics, all things decay at an equal rate, in a couple of words. So the selfish gene, likewise, is obsolete biology. Now we're appreciating symbiosis, cooperation, the merger of individuals into greater wholes in an ascent of complexity. That is how biology works. And I'm no biologist, but I understand the basics of it. Hated biology in school, by the way. And so I didn't want to learn about cells and genes and all of that stuff. Now I wish I'd listened more. So the emergence of systems thinking in biology is part of a peace narrative. Nature is not one gigantic war of each against all. Its cooperation and symbiosis are primarily evolutionary principles. So, what's the foundation of a peace narrative? As I've already said, the essence of war is reduction. The reduction of the universe to an object, of life to a thing, of other people to enemies, and the simplification of complexity so that there is a thing to fight. Then, if we want to build a peace narrative, the first foundational pillar would be holistic thinking. Holistic thinking understands that everything is intimately related to everything else. That everything is part of everything else. That to exist is to be in relationship. That we're not separate individuals, but we're interdependent both practically and existentially. That we're all interexistent. Therefore, anything that we see as an enemy is part of a constellation of relationships that includes ourselves. To use a Buddhist term, the foundation of a peace narrative is interbeing. It's a connected self in a living, interdependent universe, in contrast to the separate individual in a world of other. It's like we've been talking about for months, for a year, about being awake, being aware that you are awake, being in the now. That is a foundational understanding we seek to understand the constellation of relationship, the first pillar of a peace narrative. So we've got to go out to break. We're at the end of the first segment. Sit tight during the break. We'll be right back, and I promise you not to play any copyrighted music. Hey gang, thanks for sitting on through the break. We're back. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. Come on over and see all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio. At the same time, you can come over and watch the simulcast of this broadcast in video over on my YouTube channel. That is youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Come on over, join the live chat room going on right now, meet the other Intrepids, and join in on the conversation. We left off in the first segment talking about defining what is this peace narrative I'm talking about. It's the realization that we are all part of the whole. We are not individual entities separate from each other in nature. And from that foundational understanding, we seek to understand what I mentioned as being the constellation of relationship. That is the first pillar of peace narrative. What's a constellation? It's individual stars that make up pictures in the sky. The Big Dipper, the Little Bit Dipper, Ursa Major, Ursa Minor, Vega, Leo, all of those. And so a constellation is the individual stars that make up the greater picture. And that's the first pillar of the peace narrative. So if you're getting strep throat a lot, you might seek to understand, how is the bacteria part of my body ecology? In fact, a healthy microbiome on the mucous membranes of the throat includes friendly bacteria that secrete substances that suppress the pathogenic bacteria. And killing the strep bacteria will end that particular episode of illness, but it also kills off the friendly bacteria, leaving you more susceptible. So this exemplifies a general principle. War creates the conditions for war. So when you bomb the terrorists, you get rid of the bacteria, you create conditions for more terrorism. And when you lock up the criminals and destroy families and destroy communities, you're creating conditions that breed more crime. This is as a general overview. So looking through a holistic lens, the lens of interdependency, of interrelationship, the base conditions that breed all things we war against become visible. And we no longer then default to fighting something. That doesn't mean that there's never a time to fight, however. Is that clear, too? I'm not saying there's not times we have to fight. It doesn't mean you never run away from a robber or you're never to use antibiotics. Maybe theoretically you know that this person's about to harm your child because he suffered childhood trauma himself. You might think that and know that in the back of your brain, but in the moment, that doesn't help you. And the only response you can see is to intervene forcefully. If I saw somebody attacking my wife or my child, I wouldn't say, "Gee, we have to deal with your past hurts. Did you not get breastfed enough? Are there traumas in your past?" No! I'm going to take them out. So the problem comes when we default to the fight first because we're so used to seeing the world in terms of good and evil. So a fight becomes the default, the reflexive response. And sometimes it's absolutely necessary to default to the fight. Sometimes you need that. So that brings us to the pillar of compassion. When we can understand the conditions that generate the behavior that we're fighting against, then there's other options, specifically the option of changing the conditions of the test. Those of you who are Star Trek fans, how did James T. Kirk win the Kobayashi Maru or solve it? He changed the conditions of the test. And so that leads to the second pillar that we're calling compassion, the pillar of compassion. What's compassion? How do you view compassion? How do you define compassion? Do you have compassion? Have you felt compassion toward you? Do you think we live in a compassionate society? It's not the superior person indulgently patronizingly tolerating or sympathizing with the condition of the inferior person. That's not compassion. Compassion is basically feeling what it's like to be someone else. Maybe you can wrap that up in a bit of empathy as well. It's the experience of identifying with somebody else and knowing what it's like to be them. It comes from the question, what is it like to be you? What are the conditions that have made you into who you are? And how can I participate in the evolution of those conditions? You know, we look at the riots that are going on now, currently in our society. Hopefully they're subsiding a bit. And they're going around the world, as a matter of fact. We look at the protests, and sometimes we go, that's those people. Well, have we ever stopped to think of maybe what they feel about their condition or their experience? We might disagree with them. We might be able to produce facts and figures and so on, but does that eliminate their feelings? No. It generally intensifies them. So the second pillar of compassion is understanding the conditions that have made us into who we are, have made them into who they are, and how I can participate in the evolution of those conditions. So for most people that are growing up in this society, to see those conditions requires a lot of deprogramming, a lot of getting out of what we were once taught was so. Deprogramming from condemnation, from which side are you on, from judgment in the sense of, if I were you, I wouldn't have done that, I'm better than you, or maybe I'm worse than you. Usually it's, I'm better than you. That's the usual argument we hear. I wouldn't do that way. You should do it my way, because I'm better. And these are points that I've made many times. I've said these things. I've used the example of how inner city youth are demonized as thugs in total ignorance of their social and their economic conditions. And in having these conversations with people, I have heard that the argument from their side that they couldn't really be morally blamed for their behavior. But I've also been told that that doesn't hold up for white supremacists. She said, I can understand why a black kid who grew up in the ghetto might turn to crime when there's no other economic opportunities, and he suffered intergenerational trauma, doesn't have a dad in the home, never has, raised with a bunch of other kids that never had dads in the home. But those white supremacists don't have any excuse. Look at those guys with their bellies hanging out over their belts, in their t-shirts and their hats, the very picture of entitlement. They've got no excuse to be the way they are. And isn't that the same thing the other way around? Not recognizing the environment they came up in. We're just waiting for someone to hate, aren't we? Here's the enemy! There he is. He's walking right over there. There's the article he wrote. There's the thing he's doing. Here's someone upon whom we can let loose with our righteous rage. And it feels so good sometimes, doesn't it? To know that you're on the side of the good and the right. It feels good to let loose with the hate. Yes. Give in to your hate. Take your lightsaber. Strike me down with it. That feeling is a clue that a hidden psychological or emotional need is operating. Ultimately, it comes from the wound of self-rejection. And I gotta tell you, I don't want you to be turned off by this kind of talking. Because you know what? Every side of everything that is out there, that is in that war narrative, every side has a reason they've come there. A reason they've developed. A reason they deeply believe. Do you think that people who spout things that we don't believe about society are just lying and making it up? Or is it that their experience has led them to believe that way? A few years ago, there was this biker gang riot in Texas. They were rival gangs. They converged at a bar. And they started beating each other up in the parking lot. And the police came. They started beating up the police, too. It was a horrendous, violent riot. And I read about it in the Salon magazine, which featured photographs of the men involved in this incident. Of course, they chose the most contemptible, unflattering pictures you could imagine. And the subheadline should have been, "Here's someone you can hate. There's the bad guy. Here he is. Here's a picture of him." Of course, every time they ran an article about Donald Trump or anyone else in the opposite camp, they chose an unflattering photograph too. So both sides do that. And you ever seen pictures of Joe Biden when the more conservative news media is talking about him? Not flattering usually. Both sides do it. And it's a part of the war strategy of dehumanization. Why do you think people can try to hate Trump as much as they do? They have to dehumanize him. I've called it demonizing him. Every word that comes out of his mouth is to be dehumanized or demonized. And me, I look at those photographs and think, once upon a time, every one of those men was a cute little baby. And what happened to you, I want to ask? Why are you the way you are now? And I look deeply, and sometimes I can see a hurt and frightened kid. That's at the core of all that. Bewildered by the brutality of the world. That begets a different kind of solidarity than that of war. We don't need a common enemy anymore to join together. Now, you go up to somebody who wants to beat the shit out of you and you tell them, "I think you had a bad childhood," you'll probably get twice the beating. So, on the spot doesn't always work. This is where I say sometimes it's necessary to fight. But compassion is the opposite of dehumanization, upon which the war narrative thrives. It sucks the energy. It grows itself off of dehumanization. Dehumanization is a simplified narrative, a simplifying narrative, which is the opposite of holism or interbeing. The habit is, for example, when addressing racism, to blame it on the individual attitudes of bad people who have suppressed others, racists. And racism is caused by racists, right? Or could it be that racists are a symptom of racism, not the cause? And that by dehumanizing them, we reinforce the basic psychic template of racism. Racism is dehumanization, and it will not be solved by dehumanizing the racists. Oh, it might feel good. You get to be on team good. We're the non-racists. But is that what you want to serve? Or would you rather be serving the healing of racism? And what brings that around? What makes that happen? Have you noticed that the people calling people racists are generally expressing racism themselves? It's because they're locked in a war narrative, us against them, dehumanizing those that they think are the problem. That happens on both ways around. Is that the God you want to serve? That's a good question to ask yourself. So what about sacrificing winning? I have a feeling that the healing of humanity, healing of the earth, that we all want so much, is going to require sacrifice. We're going to have to sacrifice the identity of being the moral, the ethical, the right side of the issue. I'm guilty of that. I want to be on the right side. I want to know things. I want to be moral. I want to be ethical. Yet I make my own mistakes. But we have to sacrifice the need to be all of those things. The need to pump ourselves up as being moral, ethical, and right. And nearly everyone imagines themselves to be moral, ethical, and right. I've seen people I've fought with on the opposite side of issues that believe that they are the moral high ground, when I believe I'm the moral high ground. So for things to change, an awful lot of letting go is necessary. But only for the other side, right? They need to let go of that. Are you willing to hold as lightly to your own righteousness as you wish them to hold to theirs? How are we any different? The third pillar of a peace narrative is to end the internal war and to develop a peace narrative inside ourselves. Be awake, be aware, be in the now. Notice what you bring to the table. It's to heal the wound of self-rejection and thus to remove the psychic engine of war. The division of the world into us and them, good and evil, me, the good person, them, the bad person. The best, easiest way to establish your identity as a good person and meet the need for self-acceptance is in contrast to the evil people. So, are you willing to give that up? Are you willing to give up having been right all the time? I always have to be right in the things I say, the things I type, the positions I hold. How much do you care about peace? I know it was, why am I slipping on his name? Hancock, who said, is life so sweet or is peace so sweet or life so dear as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. For I tell you now, I'll give me liberty or give me death. Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton said that. Why am I slipping on that, folks? Help me out. Hamilton, Hancock, who said that? And I shouldn't. And I've known that for decades. And for all of a sudden, I'm slipping on which name it is. So he stood up and said that. So how much do you care about peace? It said that, and by the way, in his case, fighting and warring, the war narrative was necessary. So it said that one can't serve two masters. Temporarily you can. You can serve peace and at the same time serve getting the approval of an in-group. You can serve peace and at the same time serve your identity as a good person. You can serve peace and at the same time serve your goal of being heard, of being seen as a moral, ethical, upright, righteous person, being recognized as that, of being seen as a leader, of believing yourself to be moral. You can serve both for a while, but eventually the generosity of the universe is such that you'll reach a choice point where you get to decide what you really serve, and you then need to make a sacrifice, and this can be a bitter pill for many of us to have to swallow. Now, please understand something. I'm not making a moral exhortation to drop hatred and anger. I'm not the privileged white guy imploring those he has oppressed not to be angry with him. I'm none of those things. I'm not an oppressor. I'm not a privileged white guy. I'm just saying I'm not those things. I'm not the things that the war narrative says I am. The point here is not that anger or hatred are wrong. It's that the energy of anger is neutralized when it's diverted towards symptoms rather than causes. You get that? Let me repeat that. The true energy of anger is neutralized when it's diverted toward the symptoms rather than the causes. It is that hatred is based on a misdiagnosis of cause. They lead either to revenge, defeat, or endless war. The temptation to go to war is everywhere. Maybe you get upset about GMO seeds and Monsanto, which is now Bayer, vigorously spreading GMOs around the world, destroying peasant agriculture, corrupting entire governments, instituting the next iteration of industrial agriculture, planting seeds and varieties that were developed by indigenous cultures, and so on. Okay, got to stop this. And how are we going to do that? Well, in the mentality of war, step one is to identify somebody as the bad guy. Easy. The Monsanto executives. And why are they doing that? How could they? If I were them, I wouldn't do that, would I? I wouldn't make those decisions. If I were I almost said the F word. If I were a frickin' executive, I wouldn't destroy and pollute the waters like that. All for what? For my greed? I can't believe those people. Let's arouse some hatred. Let's tear those fuckers down. Oops, did it again. That's the strategy. Let's destroy them. Imagine that you're a Monsanto executive, and you hear everybody talking about how greedy you are, how horrible you are, and you're thinking, I walk my neighbor's dog when they're on vacation. I work really hard. My colleagues respect me. I'm advancing science to feed the hungry. I love my wife and kids, or my husband and kids, as it may be. Or maybe he's a fracking executive, and his story's about building America's energy independence. In their story, they're the good guys. We're building our nation's independence from foreign oil. And by demonizing them, you seem ridiculous to them. You're in fact offering yourself as the bad guy by the way that you see them and relate to them. So you see, it's on both sides. Have you ever stopped to think the only reason that we can demonize executives, rich executives of companies, is to dehumanize them? They're no longer people who walk the dog and pick up dog poop in their yard or hire somebody to do it. Depends on how rich you are and what you enjoy doing, but they're no longer people. We have to dehumanize them so we can fight them and war against them and hurt them. So what's the alternative? Earlier I described two possibilities. Either get defeated by the military-industrial complex, or you overcome them and you become the new complex. We talked about that a bit on Friday. Here's the new boss, just the same as the old boss. We don't get fooled again. What's the alternative? The alternative comes from an entirely different place. Interbeing. It starts by asking, why? Why is he so greedy? Or why is she pro-fracking? Or why is he violent? Or why are those people, you know who they are, pro this or anti that? What story informs their belief system? And what state of being co-resonates with that story? What's their experience in life? All we judge, we begin to investigate as symptoms. We ask, for example, where does greed come from? That question opens up insights, understanding, new possibilities for change. We might discover that it's another one of those symptoms, just like strep. It's a symptom of an experience of scarcity. It's a hunger that can never be met by the objects that are offered to feed it. If someone is cut off from community, cut off from nature, cut off from means in their lives, they're going to be hungry for those things. But instead, what's offered is money, prestige, possessions, power. Those are the substitutes modern society most conspicuously offers. You look at the racial tension issue. It's a symptom of an experience. And our reaction to it might be a symptom of experience. I'm debating whether to say this. But in being called a white, privileged, racist male, when I know I'm none of those things, it irks me. It brings up the fight in me. I'm going to fight that person who says that to me, who thinks that I am that. Because they don't know really that I'm not those things, but they've dehumanized me to put me in those categories. So do we fight for understanding? Does that person want to understand why they would think I am those things? No. Those things are the weapons of creating their narrative, their war narrative. Same on my side. I don't try to understand where they're coming from. I fight the idea and the notion because it's wrong. A story is an invitation. We've only got no time left, frankly. If you can look at a person that you call an enemy and see in them what actually, on a deep level, they want what you want and want what all people want, to contribute their gifts to a more beautiful world, to be generous, to belong, to know and be known, to love and be loved, to serve a purpose beyond themselves. If you can see that in another person, you'll be able to speak to that, and you'll be able to create an invitation to that. Oh, there's so much more. I'm still not through with this. Tomorrow we're going to pick this up because we're out of time tonight. Seek the peace narrative. Look at what you bring to the table and why you bring it to the table. We'll talk about this more tomorrow night. Have a good night. We'll see you in 23 hours. Sit tight.